everyone, welcome back to Feather Stitch House. My name's Rebecca and each week on this channel I upload videos about embroidery and textile art to help you get creative. Thanks so much for joining me today. I do so enjoy our sewing sessions together, so if you're new here you are very welcome and I think you're in for a treat today. If you are a returning visitor to see how the mushrooms turn out, then welcome back. I have fully gone mushroom mad this month, and in honour of this panel I thought I'd wear my mushroom dress as well. So it is Mushroom Central at Feather Stitch House this week. As promised, we are going to add all the texture to our panel today. So I'm going to teach you some stitch techniques that add texture and also some fabric manipulation techniques that are going to work as well. So you'll need some tiny scraps really today, embroidery threads, and if you have something like linen or scrim, that would work really well. Ideally you want a fabric that frays really easily, so something with quite an open weave. If you have them, you could do with something like a watercolour pen, but a felt tip pen would work as well, or a marker, I think you call them across the pond, so that would work as well. And other than that, some textured threads or wool, anything textural that you have in your stash that you can bundle up and couch down. Now, if you are new to stitching and textile art and you don't have anything like that, then can I recommend that as you're sewing, you save all the ends of thread and use those, because everything can be made to work in this panel. I will be back at the end for a little bit of an update about what's going to be happening for Feather Stitch House over the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. But otherwise, gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching.
Okay, here's where we got up to last week, and if you tuned in for last week's video you will notice that I have added a little bit of stitch. So because I wasn't going to be doing anything different to what I showed you last week when we did our thread painting, I've added some stitch to the cap of the Shaggy ink cap and just a little bit to the stem, and I've also put some stitch on the stem here. If I bring it up close, hopefully you'll be able to see a bit better what I've done. So I've added some really long stitches on here to try and help create that sense of shagginess. Started with the dark grey, I've got a mid grey in there, and then I've gone to lighter greys up to just an off-white at the top, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, but the stem of the ink cap is actually quite smooth, so I've just put a little bit of stitch on to create a little bit of shadow. And with the blue round head, I've used actually all the same threads. Their stems are much grayer, and I've used shorter stitches because it's the stem here that is shaggy and the shagginess is different on the two mushrooms. So today is all about texture. We're going to create our textural mushrooms and then we're going to add some texture around the bottom to kind of ground our mushrooms so they're not just floating in space. So let me show you pictures of the two mushrooms that we're going to work on first. So here's our blue round head, and you can see it's got a very grey stem and it's got these little horizontal scales almost that so rather than having a solid frill all the way around, it's got these little horizontal scales. If I show you a different picture, it's a bit blurry because the focus is on the top, but you can see the same. So it has got a frill here which we can add, but it's got these little frilly bits and this sort of ragged vertical texture. You can see it a little bit better on this one. So it's kind of a combination of these little ragged vertical markings and these horizontal bits of frill. And then the Shaggy ink cap, you can see that the stem is really quite smooth. I don't think the camera will pick it up, but there are occasional vertical markings on this stem, but the scales and the texture on the cap is much more significant, so it's a lot looser, longer strands, if you like. It's almost like the fibres of the mushroom are peeling back. So that's what we're going to create. Just out of interest, it's called the ink cap because it leaks a black liquid. This is one leaking liquid, so if you wanted to, you could put in the inky blobs. I think it looks quite sticky and viscous rather than being like liquid ink, but it looks almost gelatinous. But that's another ink cap that's started leaking. That's where it gets its name from. So I'm going to keep my pictures handy just to remind me what I'm doing, and I'm going to start with this stem here. Now we're working in greys, and I've got a little bit of linen here, and if I look at the Salvage on this, it's got a lovely sort of tufty edge, and so that is what I'm going to try and use. Now Salvages are quite hard to fray further, so I'm going to see if it works. So I'm going to get my needle in just to help out the process. I love how sort of fluffy and tufty it is. Not every Salvage is frayed, but with linen, most of the linens I have got do have this fluffy frayed Salvage, so I think it's going to work quite well. So if it doesn't fray easily, you can just get your needle in to catch one of the warp threads, or the weft, sorry, one of the weft threads, the ones that are going horizontally across the weave, and pull them out. So now we've got something that is much more tufty and frilly. We're going to be working in quite small sections here. So what I'm going to do is cut, I've got maybe a centimetre section there. Let's just thread up a needle. So I've just got a single strand here of a grey thread, and I'm going to just trim back. I'm not going to throw anything away, so this little piece that I've just cut off I can use, and I'm just going to lay it on my mushroom there. You could pin it if you wanted to, and you can make these even smaller if you want to, but let's just start with this. And first of all, I'm going to just put a couple of back stitches to hold that in place. There's loads of ways that you could add this tufting onto the mushroom, but I've used Salvages before and it worked really effectively, so I thought we could start with this. I'm going to try something a bit different on the ink cap. So that's that in place. I can fray it a bit more if I want to. I think that's enough though. I'm just going to put another line of stitches very close to where it started fraying. And if it works like it's worked before, that line of stitches just next to that frayed edge is going to cause the frayed edge to curl up a little bit. If it doesn't, we can help it along, so don't panic. It is working. So I'm just right next to where the fraying is starting, and if I pull my stitch quite tight, it's going to force that selvage to curl up. like that. So I haven't done anything to that. Hopefully you can see there that it's just curling forward all by itself. Now if it doesn't do that, the way I've fixed it before is I've ironed up, and that will curl your selvage a little bit further out. Now obviously I've now got a hard edge. What you can do if you want to is blend that in by adding in some vertical stitches. So I'm just adding some vertical stitch over the edge of that piece of fabric to blend it with the stitches that I've already put in place. Now if you wanted to, you could leave that vertical stitching, so you could leave the stitching that I've already put on until after you've put in your tufts, but I kind of wanted you to see the technique before there was any distraction on there. So you can blend that as much as you want to. I think I'm going to leave that there. So that's my first little tuft. Now if you like, you could add in different shades of grey. So I've got a darker shade here. You can see this edge is beautifully tufty, so I could put some darker frills in if I want to. I've also got some natural linen. It's not the Salvage, but that offers a much paler grey colour, so I might add a couple of those in. Let's add a little tuft of this. Let's do a narrower one. So if you struggle with tiny pieces, you could, if you wanted to, use a dab of fabric glue on this. So I'm just catching, this is one of those glues that starts bright garish yellow and it dries white, this one. So know your glue, some of them dry clear, some of them don't, this one doesn't. So whatever glue is left on the surface, it's going to be white when it's dry, so I need to cover that over. So again, I can stitch it with some back stitch just to hold it in place. So hopefully if I do this a second time, you'll see that it should work. You don't want it to be too regular, so this piece has already gone quite ragged, it started fraying. I don't mind that because that's going to look far more organic and irregular. So I'm now stitching very close to the frayed edge and I'm pulling those stitches quite tight. It's going to force those frayed fibres to curl up a little bit. Just bringing that one back in. If you don't have any selvages, then just some fabric that you fray would work perfectly well. So there's a little lighter grey tuft and I can blend that in just like before. So this is all about knowing what happens to fabric when you treat it in particular ways. So what we're doing to make them curl up is putting pressure on a particular part of this tiny scrap of fabric. That is making the bit that isn't trapped down behave in a particular way. So it's just using the natural way that fabric behaves when you put it under certain conditions to create the effect that you want, and that's essentially all that there is to fabric manipulation. It's learning what fabric does. There's our first two little shaggy bits of blue rounded head stem, so I'm going to put some more of those on, and then I'll show you a different technique to create the shaggy ink cap. Right, here we go. Here's our shaggy stem on our mushroom. So that's the source photo, and here's, if I bring it up closer, it's not as shaggy as it appears. So we do have flatter sections in between those tufts, but I think that bit of salvage has worked quite well. I haven't gone all the way down to the bottom because we're going to cover that up. So that's where we're up to so far. Before we go on to the ink cap, I thought we could create our skirt on the fly agaric. So I've got a little piece of natural linen. It's fairly pale. I think it's going to work quite well as a colour match, and again I'm going to fray it. So this isn't salvage, this is just a little scrap that I found in my scraps bin. I'm going to fray it quite a bit, so I've got maybe half a centimetre, getting on for a centimetre of frayed edge. I'm going to trim up the top just so that it's a bit flatter and straighter, and I've got a strand of a paler grey, one that isn't going to show up against the linen, and I'm going to start by just about half a centimetre down. I'm going to do a running stitch through it. I'm going to keep those stitches as small as I possibly can. So I haven't gone all the way along, I'm just going to pull on that and just gather it ever so slightly. I just want to gauge how much I need to cover that space. I want it gathered a little bit more than that. I've got to be very gentle because this frays really easily, so I don't want to fray the top so that my stitching pops out of the top. So I'm just easing it along. I think that's going to be enough. It's quite hard to see because the thread's the same colour as the linen, but I'm just going to trim that off, avoiding cutting my thread. And while that thread's still in, I'm going to find my little place that I left, my spot that I left for the skirt of this mushroom, and I'm just going to take my thread through to the back. Like that. So I want to just make sure it's covering the space on the stem, and I want to put it on so that it's forming a little bit of a curve. So if it's flat, it's not going to help our mushroom look round. So we don't want it in a straight line. That sort of ruins the illusion that the stem is rounded. So I want to put it on a little bit of a curve, and I'm just going to grab a pin to hold that in place. Just going to pull my thread and make sure I'm properly gathered, and just like we've done with the frills on our blue round head, I'm just going to stitch that in place with a back stitch. So I'm a little way down from the top of that piece of fabric, and I want one of my stitches to go over the edge just to make sure it's properly held down. I want to kind of flatten out those gathers with my stitches, so I am stitching over the top of those gathers to kind of squash them a little bit. Now that's going to make the top edge of the fabric kick up, just like we've done deliberately here, and I don't really want that, so I'll show you how I'm going to address that in a moment. Using my needle to just steer the fabric into that curve that I'm looking for, and we're just going up to the outside edge here, and I'm making sure that I've got a stitch that goes over the outside edge, and that's just going to hold the edge of this quite chaotic scrap of fabric into the edge of the felt, and you can go over that a couple of times if you want to. And again, if you want to, if your frill is still looking a little bit wild, you can go back and put another line of running stitches a little bit further down, and that will flatten out your frill against the stem of the mushroom and just tame it a little bit, but it also makes sure it's really secure. And again, I'm going to tuck my last stitch right up against the edge of the felt to just hold that frill in place. I might just put another stitch there. Like that. I'm just going to make sure I don't have any loose fibres. I've got a couple of little bits. If you've got bits that are a bit wild that don't want to come out easily, you might have caught them with a stitch. You don't want to just keep pulling on them because you could cause yourself a problem. I'm just going to trim that up at the edge, so I've got my very sharp embroidery scissors in, and I just want to trim any bits of fraying along that edge. You could leave it just like that. I don't think that looks too bad with a kind of double frill. You can fold it over itself. In fact, I think I am going to leave it like that. If you don't like that, you can, just like we did here, you can sort of blend this edge in with some more vertical stitching, and it will just look like the springing point of the mushroom. But I'm going to enhance that. I will press it back. You can manipulate it a little bit, give it a bit of a curl up if you want to. So that's our fly agaric skirt. I'm liking it so far. So for this frill here, this was much shorter and there's kind of a double layer, and I'm going to use a different technique again. So here I've got 3 strands of a pale grey threaded up into my needle. You could do a beige or a cream, anything that's fairly subtle would work. And we're going to do something called turkey stitch. So this is unusual because I don't have a knot in the end of my thread, and we're going to start by coming down from the front. So I'm just going to take my needle through a little way in from the edge at the top of that frill, and I just want to get to a point where I've got a little bit of thread tufting forward like that. So I'm going to hold that in place with my thumb, and this time I'm going to come up right at the edge of that line. I'm going to go across about just over 1/2 centimetre to the other side of that initial thread end that I've left sticking out, go back down through the felt, pull through to a loop, and then I'm going to bring my thread back up right next to where I started, so right next to that initial tuft, and pull through. And you just want to make sure that your tuft and your working thread are above that loop. Now that loop forms kind of a locking stitch that's going to hold that in place. And so we're going to make the same stitch again right next to that first one. So you can cut off if you want to, but you can do it with loops. So I'm going to loop my thread so that I'm going back down a little. That's the end of my first stitch here. I'm going to go a little way across and go back down there. So I'm following the curve. See how those stitches end there? Following that curve. And I want to leave a loop that's about the same length as that initial thread end that I left sticking out. I'm holding it out of the way. Now I'm coming up at the end of that first horizontal stitch. Pulling through. I'm going to hop across and take my needle back down a little distance away from that loop, pull through a little way, and then come back up at that loop, so right next to that loop, and now I pull through fully. So we've got a thread end, a loop, and my working thread, and we've got these little bars that are holding them in place. So we're going to go again, going to make a loop, so I'm taking my thread down a little way away from that last horizontal, pull through until I've got a loop. I'm leaving these loops quite big. You can actually make them a lot smaller than this because we're going to trim some of this off. Then I'm going to come up at the end of that last horizontal stitch, hop across and go back down a little way away from that loop, and then we're going to come up right next to that loop that we've just left and pull through. So I'm going to stitch all the way along like that, and then I'll show you how to finish off the line. So when you get to the end of your line, I'm going to hop over, so here's my loop, I'm going to hop over it, come back up next to my loop and pull through, and then I'm going to cut off my thread like that and leave a little bit of a tuft, so that doesn't look very much like a mushroom skirt at the moment. I'm going to do another line of stitches just like that, but I'm going to slightly offset them this time. So I'm going to start halfway along, so you can see this is my thread end, that's where I started before. Then I've got my loop, and this time I'm going to go down right in the middle of that loop, so I'm using the horizontal stitches as my guide, and I'm going to take my needle down at the joining point of the first two horizontal stitches. I'm going to go back a little way, go over to the meeting point of the two loops, so here, I'm going to go down there, and then I'm going to come back up next to my thread end like that and pull through. So I'm going to make another line of stitches that are just slightly offset, so my thread end should sit in the middle of that loop from the first row of stitches like that. So I'm going to stitch another line there, and then I'm going to do another 2 lines at the bottom of this band here, and then I'll come back and show you what happens next. So I've done my usual trick of forgetting to press record. So I'd already trimmed back my stitches. I've just put in another line of loops just so that I can show you what I did. So if you can see the loops there, what I do next is I hook my scissors into each loop, and I'm just going to snip them. These get smaller as I go along, but the principle is the same. So just want to find any loops like that, and obviously that's way too long, and I would recommend start being cautious to start. You can take more off, but you can't put it back on. So what you want to do then is go across horizontally and trim off the ends and trim it back, and you want to keep trimming tiny little shavings until your frill is as long as you want it to be. So I do want these to be quite short. I want it to look more fluffy than hairy, particularly this one at the bottom. And when you are happy with the length, so hopefully you can see that when you trim it back it looks kind of furry like that. I think that's a good length. And top tip for dealing with the fluff so there are no bits all over that, I've got a lint roller here, and I'm just going to roll across the surface, and that will pick up any straggly bits of fluff. And so that is our fly agaric with its 2 frills. Jolly good. Right, let's do our ink cap. So you could use any of the methods that we've used so far. You could use turkey stitch and leave your strands a lot longer. I've decided that I'm going to actually use some scrim, and because scrim frays so easily, you can see it literally is just falling apart. It's going to be really hard to use in the way that we did these tufts, and so I'm going to do this in a slightly different way. So let's start at the top, and I'm going to lay my scrim just as it is in a piece just along the edge of my mushroom. I've got some warm grey thread here, it's quite pale, and I'm just going to catch a section of that down. So I want my stitches to be in place. You can see I'm working this slightly diagonally. We're going to have these going in lots of different directions. Like that, and then rather unusually I'm going to put a couple of cross stitches above that. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to catch the warp and the weft. So the warp is the vertical threads in our fabric, and the weft is the horizontal. I want to catch both, and so a cross stitch is going to do that quite nicely for me. Okay, so once I've stitched that in, I'm going to go just above my line of stitches and trim away the excess scrim, like that. And then we've got our first bit of shaggy texture. So I'm going to put a bit higher up, and repeat the process. Now I like this because it's got such an open weave, and I can leave quite long tails on this and it won't look odd. I also quite like the fact that they go kind of crinkly when you fray it, and because it's got an open weave I can kind of see the felt through it, so I'm getting some of the colour of the felt coming through it as well. So a couple of cross stitches. Just be really gentle if you accidentally loop your thread around the frayed ends. Just be really gentle when you're taking those off. So again, just above the stitching, and I can trim so that I'm following the edge of the mushroom. Try not to catch your organza behind. So we've got a little bit of shagginess coming in straight away with that, and I'm going to do the rest of the mushroom cap in the same way. And if you're worried about the colour not being quite right, this is kind of beigey. Now it does get a lot greyer as we go down. I'll show you how I'm going to achieve that in a moment. So I'm going to put in the rest of my shaggy bits on my ink cap mushroom, and then I'll show you how I'm going to make them greyer at the bottom. Right, so I've put all my shaggy ink cap scrim on, and I've gone over some of these lower ones with just some straight stitches in dark grey. They're still standing out a little bit much though, so what I have here is a watercolour pen, and I'm assuming that you would get a similar result with just a normal marker pen, felt tip pen. I'm just going to brush over that scrim on the lower levels and just darken it up and blend it in a little bit more. So because this is watercolour, it's going to soak into the fibres of the scrim and just colour it up a little bit. It won't be even though, which works quite well because you don't get an even sort of grey colour on these shaggy ink caps. So there are some whiter, lighter bits, beigey bits. So I'm just kind of brushing over the fibres. Will dry a little bit lighter because that's the nature of watercolour. As the liquid dries, as the water in it dries, they'll lighten up a bit, but hopefully that will just add a little bit more colour. And I'm just going to gently brush over these lower strands as well, so I'm going a little bit denser on these bottom fibres, and I'm going with a bit of a lighter touch as I go further up. So I'm just putting some touches of darker colour. So that's my shaggy ink cap. And that's all our mushrooms done. So now we're going to do some grounding, and I don't want to overdo this because I want to keep my background on show, but I've got a collection of items here, so let me show you what I've gathered together. First of all, I've got some wools, and so I found some sort of greens and beiges and browns. So that's the first thing. I don't know if you remember this from October week 1. This is a little bit of netting that I got from some satsumas. So I've got some of that as well. I've basically gone through my stash and looked for anything textural. Then I've also got some textured threads. So I've got some quite fluffy threads here. This one's almost like a velvet chenille. And then I've also got this stuff. Now, I've got no idea what this is called. Somebody please do tell me in the comments. It's wool, but it's not spun and it's super curly, and I've got some lovely sort of autumnal colours there, some golds, a bit of green, some darker green there, and this lovely sort of gingery auburn colour. So I think we can get some of that in as well. I'm going to start with the most textural things that I have. I'm just going to use some normal machine thread initially because we just want to do a bit of couching first of all. Let's start with a bit of this. I'm just going to cut a bit off to start with, and I want to sort of sit it around the base of the mushrooms. Let's just twist it together, and we're going to create a bit of ground for our mushrooms to sit in. So I'm just coming up from the back of the fabric, just normal machine thread, putting a little stitch over the top, and you can tame this as much as you want to. So you can flatten it out quite a lot, or you can leave it quite textured. It's entirely up to you. So go with what feels right. I like this, it looks quite mossy when you couch it down like this. So it's going to create something like greenery on a forest floor. And it really doesn't matter what machine thread you're using because you can't see any of those stitches. So that's a little bit there. Let's put a little bit more on. I want to cover over the curve at the bottom of my chanterelles. So this is all about just having fun with texture now. I think you'd agree that already that's looking more like it's grounded rather than floating in the air, and I'm just going to carry on adding more texture and a little bit of stitch as I'm talking. Now, as you may have spotted, I am on a mission to get everybody to fall in love with mushrooms this month, and part of that comes from one of my favourite books. Now, this is part of a series of books made by various museums in Britain, and the one I wanted to show you is called Fungarium, which is produced by the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew, which is in London in the UK. And apart from how utterly beautiful this book is in its design, it's packed with the most fabulous information. Now, there aren't chapters. The information in this book is arranged in galleries, and so it's like walking through a museum as you read. The illustrations are just stunning, but it's also packed with just really juicy facts, and I feel like I've got to know fungi so much better since I've been reading through this book. So let me share with you a few of my favourite little tidbits that I've come across as I've been reading. So there are 140,000 known species of fungus in the world at the moment, but that is estimated to be only 5% of the anything up to 3.8 million species that are believed to exist. New species are being discovered all the time, and we're not just talking about in rainforests and previously unexplored locations. Some are being discovered in ordinary back gardens around the world. So do have a look out for fungi growing in your garden, because you might have discovered something that's never been seen before. They are an absolutely essential part of life, and although some of us can be quite scared of mushrooms because of the fear that they are highly poisonous and are going to kill us, actually a tiny fraction of fungi are deadly poisonous. Some of them are harmful, but most are really helpful, benign organisms, and so don't be as scared maybe as you might have been. They are essential in the life cycle, so without fungi we'd be wading through leaves and branches and organic matter that won't decay, as well as being surrounded by lots of dead creatures that can't decompose. So they're an essential part of the life cycle and recycling energy and nutrients from one species to another. They are actually more closely linked with animals than they are with plants. So their cells are made of a substance called chitin, which is very close to keratin, which is what animal cells are made from. But plants are made out of cellulose, that's what their cells are made from, so they are much more closely at a cellular level aligned with animals. And just like animals, they can't manufacture their own nutrients, so plants manufacture their food from photosynthesis, but fungi can't do that. So they, just like animals find food, fungi grow towards food sources where they're going to be able to gain nutrients, and they absorb those nutrients through their cell walls. Without fungi, our lives would be completely different. So think about all the things that you buy in your weekly shop, and I'll give you a list, and just you might be surprised at some of the things that you would not be able to put in your trolley when you go to the supermarket if it wasn't for fungi. So you'd have no tea, coffee, chocolate. There are many cheeses that wouldn't be able to be produced without fungi. All alcoholic drinks and many fizzy drinks rely on fungi. If you use biological washing detergent, you wouldn't have that either. You wouldn't have soy sauce, and you wouldn't have vinegar, and the list goes on and on and on. The animals that are used to create meat products rely on fungi in their gut to be able to break down and digest cereal and grain and grass. So our shopping trolleys would be virtually empty. We'd have no dairy, no meat products, and lots of our store cupboard ingredients would be missing as well. The thing that I find most fascinating is the use of fungi in medicine. So the most famous, of course, is penicillium, which gave us penicillin, which was like the first antibiotic. And the discovery of penicillium inspired the hunt for other fungi and plant materials that could be used for medicines, and there are quite a few, some of which you might take. So if you are on statins, that is a fungus-based medicine. It comes from the fungus lovostatin and has allowed discovery of loads of other statin medicines to help control heart disease and reduce the risk of strokes and things like that. There are also drugs that are used as immunosuppressants. So one is called cyclosporine, which is used in transplant surgery to help transplant patients not reject their new transplanted organs. And there's another one called myriocin, which is used in the treatment of MS. And there are a whole range of other immunosuppressant drugs. So I hope that gives you the inspiration to find a little bit of room in your heart for fungi because they are so important in all of our lives. We wouldn't quite be the same without them. Okay, so here is my finished mushroom panel. I've put in all my texture at the bottom to sort of ground my mushrooms, and if I bring it up close, you should be able to see I've got some of the netting in there. I've got some of the sort of fluffy wool. I use my little curly bits of fleece, that chenille yarn. I've put in some beige wool in kind of French knots and some dark green as well, and I've just tried to keep it really free and loose and uneven across the bottom there. So while I'm here, I'll give you a quick tour. So that's my Shaggy ink cap. It's all dried now, so that grey paint has gone a little bit paler. There's my blue round head with the shaggy stem, and my stitch mushrooms from last week. That's my fly agaric with the skirts at the bottom and halfway down. I've pressed those down a little bit, and that is my wax cap. And I used a batik fabric that I'd got in autumnal colours and put my month marker on just like I normally do. I have enjoyed this one so very much. I hope you have as well. If you aren't sure how to do the binding, I will link a video up here where I explain it in more detail. It's just strips of fabric and I haven't mited the edges or anything like that.
So there it is. I can't tell you how much fun I've had making this panel. I know I say it every time, but this one really is my absolute favourite. It is so me. So if you wanted Rebecca in a piece of textile art, that's about as close as you're going to get. The colours are totally my colours, and it's all about stitch on felt and playing around and having just some fun with textures and stitches and threads. So I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as I have. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you create. Please do post. It fills my heart with joy to see your versions of our Winging It projects. So if you're not sure why I call it Winging It, by the way, these are all improvised. So I've only got a rough idea of the direction of travel before I start, and the rest I make up as I'm going along, and I just problem solve and work it out as I'm going. Now, some of that is to do with experience, but some of it is just learning through play. So I am a firm believer in just going for it and not being constricted by the rules of embroidery or feeling that you've got to do some things a certain way. Try it. If it works, it's right. So feel free, have fun, and just play with your fabrics and thread. That's really what it's all about. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an update about what's happening over the next 2 weeks. So today, as this video goes out, I am at Leicester Racecourse at the big textile show. Next weekend, though, I'm going to be at the NEC in Birmingham for the Creative Craft Show. I'm on stand C44 and I would love to see you. So if you've been stitching along with any of the Feather Stitch House projects, so Winging It, Patchwork Adventures, the Stitch Alphabet, Please do bring your work along and show me what you've been up to. It absolutely makes my day to see how people have got creative, felt inspired and got creative because of the videos that I produce. So bring your work along, come and say hi. I would absolutely love to see you. My sister's going to be there with me and we're hoping to have a blast. So I'll have the Winging It 2022 book, I'll have last year's garden quilt, and I'll have this year's project as well. So you can come and see it in the flesh if you want to. There will be no Wednesday video next week because I am in between shows and I'm trying to be a bit kind to myself. So I'll be back next Sunday for our first November panel, and yeah, hope to see you then. So take care and I'll see you very soon. Bye.